Hey guys, tonight we begin with a little journey into the cold. So go ahead and pull your blankets up a little higher. Maybe dim the screen down to its lowest setting and just let your eyes get heavy. You are warm, you are safe, and most importantly, you are not living in Victorian London during the Great Frost of 1895. Because, as we are about to find out, surviving even a single night back then was an absolute, though very quietly polite, nightmare. Let's just drift back to February of 1895. London is normally a damp, grey, slightly smelly place during the winter. But this particular February was different. It wasn't just cold, it was the kind of cold that seemed to personally dislike you. Temperatures plummeted to -20 degrees Celsius in some parts of the country, which is about -4 degrees Fahrenheit. And for a city that was entirely built around the concept of burning cheap coal and hoping for the best, this was a structural and emotional disaster. Now, imagine the setting. The sky is a thick, bruised purple by 4 in the afternoon. The famous London fog, which was really just toxic coal smog, didn't blow away in the winter wind. Instead, the freezing temperatures trapped it close to the ground, turning the air into a sort of icy, breathable soup. People walked around looking like miserable, frost-covered ghosts, coughing politely into their handkerchiefs because, naturally, one must maintain decorum even while their lungs are crystallizing. Let's float over to how the upper crust was. Unlaying this, you would think the wealthy elite, the dukes and the earls and the fabulously rich industrialists, would be cozy in their massive estates. But you would be wrong, because if there is one thing the British aristocracy historically excelled at, it was suffering in incredibly expensive, cavernous rooms. Victorian mansions were architectural marvels of draftiness. They had these massive, gorgeous windows that let in all the light and absolutely all of the wind. A wealthy Victorian gentleman might be sitting in his library right next to a roaring fireplace, and while his left side was slowly roasting, his right side was literally accumulating a thin layer of frost. Because why not build a 50-foot ceiling in a room you plan to read a book in? It makes perfect sense if you hate being warm. And speaking of hating being warm, we really have to talk about the Queen herself, Queen Victoria, who by 1895 was very much in her elderly, perpetually mourning era, had a legendary, almost pathological hatred of hot rooms. She believed that warm air was inherently unhealthy, probably because it bred laziness, or whatever Victorian doctors were making up that week. So, in her royal residences, she mandated that the temperature be kept at what can only be described as a brisk, aggressive chill. Windows were kept open. Yes, even in February, even during the Great Frost of 1895. You have to imagine these poor, aristocratic ladies-in-waiting, women who had spent their entire lives being pampered, now standing in the corners of Osborne House or Windsor Castle, their teeth chattering so hard it sounded like cast. They couldn't wear heavy coats in the presence of the Queen, of course, because that would be rude. So they just stood there, wearing these restrictive, stiff silk dresses, quietly turning blue. Victoria, meanwhile, was perfectly fine, bundled in layers of black morning wool, casually writing in her diary about how refreshing the breeze was. It is a classic royal contrast. The monarch thrives, while the court slowly succumbs to hypothermia. But let's glide back out into the streets of London, where the situation was becoming far more darkly comedic. You see, the Victorians were very proud of their modern advancements. They had indoor plumbing now, which was a huge step up from throwing things out the window. But, in their infinite wisdom, the builders of Victorian London had decided to install the water pipes on the outside of the houses. Because they thought it looked neater on the inside, and they didn't want to tear up the interior walls. It was an aesthetic choice, a purely cosmetic decision that, in February of 1895, resulted in a citywide catastrophe. As the deep freeze set in, all of those exterior, completely uninsulated lead pipes froze solid, and then, because water expands when it freezes, they exploded. It started with a few pops echoing through the wealthy neighborhoods of Mayfair and Belgravia, and soon it was a symphony of bursting metal across the entire city. And it wasn't just the water coming in that froze, it was the water going out. I'll let your sleepy brain do the math on that one. The newly fashionable indoor water closets simply stopped working. The pipes were blocked by solid blocks of ice, and soon by other things. It was, simply put, a frozen biological disaster. But a quiet one. Just a slow, creeping realization that the luxurious indoor bathroom was now a useless, foul-smelling glacier. Plumbers became the most powerful men in London overnight. You could be an earl with a lineage tracing back to the Norman conquest. But in 1895, you were completely at the mercy of a tired guy named Arthur with a blowtorch and a wrench. And Arthur was booked solid until May. To make matters worse, people had to figure out how to navigate the city. The Thames, the great, swirling, muddy heart of London, began to freeze over. It didn't freeze completely solid from bank to bank like it had centuries earlier during the famous frost fairs, because the Victorians had built new embankments that made the river flow faster. But massive, jagged ice floes choked the river. Barges were locked in place. The entire shipping industry just stopped. And on the streets, the cobblestones were coated in a thick, unyielding layer of black ice. Now, modern winter clothing is designed for this. We have rubber soles, we have down jackets, we have synthetic fibers. The Victorians had leather-soled boots that had zero traction. Walking to work, or to the gentleman's club, became a slow-motion extreme sport. Picture this. A very serious Victorian banker, wearing a heavy wool frock coat, a stiffly starched collar that is basically choking him, and a top hat. He steps out of his townhouse. He takes one dignified step onto the pavement, and instantly his feet fly out from under him. He lands flat on his back, his top hat rolling sadly into a frozen puddle. And because the Victorians were obsessed with dignity, he can't even make a sound. He just has to quietly absorb the blunt force trauma, slowly stand back up, pretend he meant to do that, and try to penguin waddle his way to the carriage. And the carriages weren't much better. The horses couldn't get a grip on the ice either. So you just have this surreal, slow-motion landscape of sliding horses, sliding aristocrats, and carriages gently bumping into gas lamps. Which brings us to another lovely feature of the Great Frost. The gas lines. London was illuminated by gaslight, which gave the city that beautiful, eerie, jack-aesthetic we all know from the movies. But extreme cold messes with gas pressure. As the temperatures dropped further, the gas lamps in the streets began to flicker. And then, one by one, whole neighborhoods just went dark. So, now, it is 5 p.m. It is pitch black. It is minus 20 degrees. Your external plumbing has exploded, and you are trapped in a drafty house with a 50-foot ceiling. Because why not double down on the misery? The only way to stay warm was the fireplace. The demand for coal skyrocketed overnight. Prices doubled, then tripled. The wealthy could afford it. Naturally, they just sent their freezing servants out to buy more, piling it high in their cellars. But even with a roaring fire, the heat simply vanished into the cavernous rooms. People started engaging in really quirky, desperate habits to stay warm. They would heat bricks in the fire, wrap them in flannel, and take them to bed, which sounds cozy, until you realize that if you wrapped it poorly, you just brought a burning hot rock into a bed full of highly flammable linen. Terry are actual records of respectable members of the gentry waking up to find their mattresses gently smoldering because their bed brick got a little too enthusiastic. But I suppose a minor bed fire was at least a temporary distraction from the ambient freezing temperature of the bedroom. And let's not forget the bizarre Victorian undergarments. To combat the cold, women would layer themselves in wool. But because the fashion silhouette still demanded a tiny waist, they were wearing thick woolen combinations under bone-crushing corsets, topped with heavy velvet dresses. If you got sweaty from standing too close to the fire, that sweat was instantly trapped against your skin by the wool. And the moment you stepped into the freezing hallway, that sweat turned icy cold. It was basically a portable, wearable refrigerator. The men weren't doing much better. They wore these heavy, itchy woolen long johns that bunched up terribly under their trousers. Imagine trying to maintain an air of absolute imperial superiority while you are quietly suffering from the most intense, unscratchable itch on your left calf, and your mustache is literally crusting over with ice from your own breath. It's hard to build an empire when your face is frozen. As the days turned into weeks, the city entered a strange sort of paralysis. The elite, realizing that London was a frozen, non-functioning nightmare, did what they always did when things got tough. They tried to leave, but the train tracks were frozen too. The steam engines, huge iron beasts that usually conquered the landscape, were struggling to build enough pressure in the sub-zero air. Switches were frozen solid. Aristocrats found themselves stranded at railway stations, huddled together in waiting rooms, staring blankly at the frosted windows, realizing that all their wealth and status couldn't bribe a frozen block of steel to move. And so, they had to return to their freezing manners, to their exploding pipes and their smoldering bed. They had to sit in the dark, as the gaslights failed, wrapped in every rug they owned, politely waiting for spring. It was a tragic, ridiculous, very British kind of suffering. Just sitting in a velvet chair, shivering violently, and refusing to admit that the whole system was fundamentally flawed. Let's pause it for a moment and just appreciate the warmth of your own bed. No exploding lead pipes outside your window. No drafty 50-foot ceilings. Just peace and warmth. And the quiet night. If the universe hands a Victorian aristocrat a frozen wasteland, they do not simply stay indoors and read. They decide, with an astonishing lack of self, that it is the perfect time to strap sharpened metal blades to their boots and throw a party on a frozen body of water. Because why not double down on the risk of blunt force trauma when the nearest hospital is a bumpy, horse-drawn carriage ride away over cobblestones made of black ice? The Thames itself was too jagged and chaotic for proper skating, choked with those massive, dirty ice flows we talked about. But the Serpentine, the large recreational lake in Hyde Park, was frozen solid. And so, the elite descended. Now, if you or I go ice skating today, we wear flexible clothing. We wear things that allow our joints to bend. The Victorians looked at the laws of physics and simply politely declined to participate. Picture the scene. The lake is a sheet of dull, gray ice, reflecting the bruised purple sky. And gliding onto it are hundreds of people dressed as if they are attending a rather stiff funeral. The gentlemen are in full wool trousers, stiffly starched collars that dig into their windpipes with every movement, heavy double-breasted frock coats, and top hats. The top hat is, aerodynamically speaking, the worst possible headgear for a high-speed wind sport, but dignity demanded it. The ladies were entirely encased in velvet, heavy wool, and fur. They wore massive, sweeping skirts over multiple petticoats, and their hands were stuffed into large fur muffs. This meant that if they lost their balance, which was highly likely given the corsets restricting their lung capacity to that of a small bird, they had absolutely no way to catch themselves. They simply tipped over, like very expensive, velvet-covered bowling pins. And of course, a proper Victorian gathering required music. You couldn't just skate in silence. That would be dreadfully boring. So, wealthy patrons hired brass bands to sit on the edge of the ice and play sprightly. But playing a brass instrument in -20-degree weather is a biological and mechanical nightmare. The metal of the trumpets and tubas would instantly freeze against the musicians' lips. The condensation from their breath-to-spit valves, to be terribly unglamorous about it, would freeze solid inside the instruments. So, instead of a sweeping, romantic Strauss waltz, the skaters were treated to a slow, dying, off-pitch, grown from a tuba that was slowly filling with ice. It must have sounded like a herd of depressed walruses echoing across Hyde Park, while dukes and duchesses gracefully tried not to fracture their tailbones. It is a wonderfully tragic-comic image. The height of the British Empire, the rulers of the waves, reduced to wobbling around a frozen pond in central London, listening to frozen trumpets squeak out the faintest hint of a melody. Letesse slowly glide away from the Serpentine and look at one specific royal who absolutely refused to let the weather stop his social calendar. Albert Edward, the Prince of Wales, affectionately and somewhat exhaustedly known as Bert. He was Queen Victoria's eldest son, the future King Edward VII, and he was the exact opposite of his perpetually mourning, cold-loving mother. Bertie loved warmth. He loved massive multi-course meals. He loved cigars, and he loved a good party. Bertie was also, by 1895, a rather spectacularly round man. He had enjoyed decades of heavy banquets. So, when Bertie decided he wanted to host an outdoor skating party at his estate, and physics once again had to step in and have a quiet word. Imagine the sheer stress on the ice. Here comes the heir to the British throne, a man who regularly consumed a dozen oysters and a roasted bird just for a light lunch. stepping onto a frozen pond wearing a heavy tweed shooting suit. According to some quiet whispers from the courtiers of the time, the ice visibly bowed and groaned under the royal weight. Bertie, however, was oblivious, or at least pretended to be. He paddled around the ice with a cigar clamped between his teeth, blowing thick clouds of smoke into the freezing air, looking like a very well-dressed, slightly out-of-breath steam engine. His mistresses, his friends, and his long-suffering wife, Princess Alexandra, all had to skate politely in his orbit, pretending they weren't absolutely freezing and terrified that the future king was about to plunge through the ice and sink to the bottom like a tailored stone. It was a perfect display of dynastic weirdness, the absolute demand that reality bend to the whims of a royal, even when reality is a sheet of cracking ice. But as the days dragged on, the cold began to take a real toll, and the Victorians had to turn to their doctors. Let's just drift into the world of Victorian medicine for a moment. If you ever feel bad about your current healthcare, just remember that Victorian doctors were basically just guessing with extreme confidence. The prevailing medical theory, Tug Fadin, was still heavily influenced by miasma, the idea that bad air caused disease. In the winter of 1895, the doctors looked at the freezing, smog-filled air and decided that it was practically toxic. Their solution to this was, frankly, bizarre. Gentlemen were strongly advised by medical professionals to grow out their beards and mustaches as quickly as possible. The logic was that a thick, bushy beard would act as a natural air filter, catching the freezing miasma before it could enter the lungs. Men who couldn't grow beards were advised to tie thick woolen scarves directly over their mouths. This meant the streets were filled with men breathing heavily through damp, freezing wool, looking like incredibly polite bank robbers. The condensation from their breath would freeze on the wool, leaving them with blocks of ice resting against their lips. For the ladies, doctors prescribed heavy, dark veils to be worn over the face at all times outdoors, to warm the air before it hit the delicate female respiratory system. So now you have women in heavy morning-style veils, unable to see clearly, trying to navigate black ice in leather-soled shoes. It's a miracle anyone survived a simple walk to the apothecary. And speaking of the apothecary, the medicinal remedies for the cold were a testament to the Victorian belief that if something tasted terrible, it must be curing you. The absolute cornerstone of Victorian winter survival was a dark, salty concoction known as beef tea. Now, beef tea is not a cozy mug of Earl Grey. It was made by taking a large chunk of cheap beef, boiling it for hours until every last drop of joy and nutrition had been extracted from the meat, and then drinking the resulting brown, salty puddle. It was essentially heavily reduced beef stock, but the Victorians drank it from teacups and treated it like a magical elixir. Doctors prescribed it for everything: frostbite, beef tea, a chest cold. Beef tea, a creeping sense of existential dread brought on by weeks of darkness. You guessed it, beef tea. They believed it fortified the blood against the cold. And if beef tea wasn't working, the secondary prescription was, predictably, alcohol. Brandy and hot water were prescribed in terrifying quantities to keep the internal organs warm. This actually causes blood vessels to dilate and makes you lose body heat faster, which is the exact opposite of what you want in a freeze. But Victorian science wasn't concerned with pesky things like physiology. So, if you walked into a wealthy Victorian drawing room in late February 18, you would be greeted by a truly surreal sensory experience. The room would be dimly lit by a failing gas lamp. A massive fire would be roaring in the grate, failing to heat the room. Sitting in velvet armchairs would be a duke and duchess, wrapped in heavy rugs, holding burning hot bed. The room would smell overwhelmingly of camphor doctors told people to rub on their chests, mixed with the smell of damp wool, cigar smoke, and boiled beef. They would be quietly sipping from teacups filled with hot meat juice and heavy pours of brandy, trying to politely ignore the fact that their indoor plumbing had exploded 3 weeks ago. They were surviving, yes, but they were doing it in the most uncomfortable, stubborn, and weirdly formal way possible. And they did it all without ever raising their voices or admitting that perhaps, just perhaps, putting the water pipes on the outside of the house was a foundational error in judgment. As the weeks finally began to turn, and the calendar stubbornly inched toward March, the great freeze slowly, agonizingly, began to lose its grip. But the thaw, as the Victorians were about to discover, brought an entirely new set of deeply unpleasant and incredibly messy problems. The ice was going to melt, and everything it had trapped was going to be released. But we will leave them there for now, sipping their beef tea in the dark, happily oblivious to the watery chaos that the spring thaw is about to unleash upon their carpets. When we left London, it was a frozen, smog-choked, perfectly preserved nightmare. The wealthy were huddled around failing fireplaces, sipping their salty beef tea, and waiting for the cold to pass. And eventually, as February limped into March, the temperatures finally, agonizingly, began to rise. The sky lightened from that bruised purple to a slightly less depressing shade of gray. The great freeze of 1895 was breaking. But thermodynamics is a cruel, uncompromising force. The Victorians were about to learn a very hard, very damp lesson in physics. You see, when things freeze, they stop moving. The smells stop. The leaks stop. The decay stops. The city had been placed in a state of suspended animation, but when the thaw arrives, all of those things return, and they return all at once, with a vengeance. Let's start with the plumbing. We talked about how those brilliant Victorian architects decided to put the lead water pipes on the outside of the brick houses. We know they froze solid, and we know that, because water expands when it turns to ice, those pipes split open. But while they were frozen, they weren't leaking. The ice itself was acting as a structural plug. So, picture our wealthy banker from Mayfair. He has survived the frost. He has stopped wearing damp wool over his mouth. He is sitting in his drawing room, enjoying the balmy temperature of perhaps 4 degrees Celsius, feeling quite triumphant. And then he hears it. A slow, rhythmic, terrifying sound. Drip, and drip, and drip. The ice in the shredded exterior pipes was melting, and when the water mains were finally pressurized again, the water didn't just flow back into the house. It violently exited through every single crack and split that the frost had created. Suddenly, water was cascading down the expensive, hand-painted wallpaper. It was pooling on the thick, imported Persian rugs, and because Victorian ceilings were often decorated with intricate, heavy plaster moldings, the water soaked into the plaster until it simply gave up and collapsed, sending chunks of wet debris crashing onto the velvet upholstery. And remember the water closets, the newly installed, highly fashionable indoor toilets. Well, the pipes leading away from those had frozen too. And split. I will let you simply imagine the sheer, polite horror of an aristocratic household, realizing that the biological backlog of a 4-week freeze was now steadily thawing and finding its way backward into the house. It was a tragicomic puddle of aristocratic despair. Servants were running frantically through the halls with wooden buckets and woolen rags, trying to mop up an ocean with a sponge. The lords and ladies, completely unequipped to handle practical manual labor, simply stood in the corners of their ruined, foul-smelling drawing rooms, looking mildly offended that gravity was treating them this way. Because, of course, a duke shouldn't have to deal with a wet sock. That is simply not what the empire was built for. Let's drift outside onto the streets, where the situation was becoming a sensory overload of the worst kind. The black ice that had coated the cobblestones began to melt. But it didn't just turn into water. Victorian London ran on horsepower. Tens of thousands of horses navigated those streets every day. For a month, their, let's call it, output, had simply frozen onto the roads. Mixed with, this was a month's worth of coal soot that had fallen from the chimneys and general city grime. As the ice melted, this horrifying cocktail turned into a substance that historians affectionately referred to as macadam mud. It was a thick, black, greasy sludge that coated every single street, alley, and square in the city. It was inescapable. Think about the fashion. Men wore tailored trousers that brushed the tops of their shoes. Women wore massive, sweeping skirts that trailed on the ground. Walking through London in March of 1895 meant dragging yards of heavy velvet and wool through a freezing slurry of soot and horse manure. Inventors actually tried to capitalize on this misery. They marketed little metal gadgets called skirt lifters, which were essentially tiny, decorative tongs that a lady could attach to her hem and pull up with a string, hoisting her skirt out of the muck. But they often broke or snapped. sending the heavy fabric splashing down into the puddles, ruining the dress, and completely destroying any illusion of imperial dignity. You would just see these incredibly wealthy, powerful people slipping and squelching their way down the street, looking like damp, furious pigeons. Let's float away from the streets and over to Windsor Castle, because we absolutely must check in on Queen Victoria during this great, wet mess. Victoria, as we know, loved the cold. She practically thrived in it. But if there was one thing she hated more than a warm room, it was dirt. She demanded absolute, pristine order in her palaces, and her royal household knew this. They lived in abject terror of displeasing her. So when the thaw hit Windsor, the castle staff went into a state of silent, highly coordinated panic. Windsor is an ancient, drafty stone fortress. When the stone finally started to warm up, condensation formed everywhere. The walls literally began to sweat. The floors were damped, and every time a courtier or a visiting diplomat arrived, they dragged the black, greasy London mud in with them. The frantic efforts to hide this from the Queen were nothing short of theatrical. Legions of footmen were deployed with the sole purpose of walking slightly ahead of the Queen, quietly dropping clean rugs over muddy footprints just before she stepped on them. Maids were constantly, silently scrubbing the stone floors, trying to dry them with towels before the monarch decided to take her afternoon stroll down the corridors. Imagine this dress. You are a highly decorated lord of the realm. You have just arrived to brief the Queen on a delicate matter of foreign policy, and your shoes are emitting a loud, embarrassing squelch with every step. You have to bow, maintain total composure, and pretend that your left foot isn't currently soaking in a pool of freezing, dirty water inside your leather boot. Victoria Thorpe-Redith, or perhaps just out of sheer stubbornness, completely ignored the chaos. She continued her daily routines, writing in her journals, inspecting her dispatch boxers, seemingly oblivious to the fact that her entire staff was engaged in a desperate, quiet war against dampness. It is the ultimate royal privilege, isn't it, to simply refuse to acknowledge that the world around you is melting. And then there was Bertie, the Prince of Wales. He had survived the freeze by eating enormous meals and smoking cigars on a frozen pond, but the thaw completely ruined his schedule. Bertie loved his country sports. He loved shooting birds, but you cannot go stomping through the Norfolk countryside when the ground has turned into a freezing, bottomless bog. His boots got stuck. His hunting dogs refused to retrieve anything, presumably because they had more sense than the future King of England. Even his beloved cigars suffered. The pervasive dampness in the air seeped into the humidors, making the expensive tobacco difficult to light and sour to smoke. For a man whose entire life was built around highly structured leisure, this was a catastrophe. He grew incredibly grumpy, pacing around the halls of Sandringham, complaining bitterly to anyone who would listen that the weather was deliberately insulting him. Because, why not take the climate personally? When you are the heir to the largest empire in human history, you naturally assume that even the clouds should be paying attention to your social calendar. Slowly, painfully, the mud began to dry. The exploded pipes were patched by the exhausted, overworked plumbers of London. The ruined, waterlogged carpets were quietly thrown away and replaced by servants who were probably too tired to even complain. The great, bruised purple sky finally cleared, and the thin, pale British sun returned to warm the damp stone. The Great Frost of 1895 became just another memory, a quiet, polite trauma that the Victorians filed away in their stiff upper lips. They didn't change the plumbing, of course. They just rebuilt the exterior pipes exactly as they were, because tradition demanded it, and they went back to ignoring the cold, and ignoring the damp, wrapping themselves in velvet, and pretending everything was perfectly fine. Who'd let the image of that squelching, muddy city fade away? The cold is gone. The damp is gone. You are here. In the quiet, in the warm. It is beautiful here. The sun is shining, the empire is vast, and the palaces are filled with unimaginable wealth. But as we step inside the grand, echoing halls of the Spanish royal court, we immediately notice something is a little off. The tapestries are gorgeous, the gold is glittering, but the people running the show look, quite frankly, exhausted, and perhaps a bit geometrically challenged. Tonight, We are looking at the Habsburgs, specifically the Spanish branch of the family. If you look up dynastic weirdness in a historical dictionary, you will just find a very long, very confusing painting of these people staring blankly back at you, completely unable to fully close their mouths. To understand the Habsburgs, you have to understand their core philosophy. Back in the day, royal marriages were business transactions. You married off your daughter to a rival kingdom to secure a peace treaty, or you married your son to an heiress to acquire some prime real estate in Italy. But the Habsburgs looked at this system and thought, why give our land to other families when we can just keep it all to ourselves? It was a brilliant real estate strategy, but biologically speaking, it was a slow-motion disaster. Over the course of about 200 years, the Spanish Habsburgs managed to turn their family tree into a family wreath, a very tight, inescapable, aggressively circular wreath, because why marry a French princess and risk letting a foreigner influence your court when you have a perfectly good first cousin sitting right over there in Austria? Let's just glide into the life of King Philip IV of Spain. Philip was a patron of the arts, a lover of theater, and a man who took the Habsburg marriage policy to its most extreme, slightly depressing logical conclusion. Philip originally had a son, Prince Balthasar Charles, who was the heir to the throne. Naturally, Philip arranged for his son to marry a lovely Austrian archduchess named Mariana. Mariana was also Philip's niece. Of course, she was. But then, tragically and quietly, Prince Balthasar Charles died of smallpox before the wedding could take place. This left a void in the succession and, more importantly, to the Habsburgs, a perfectly good, politically advantageous marriage treaty completely unfulfilled. So Philip IV, who was a deeply tired, melancholy man in his 40s, looked at the situation, looked at his teenage niece, Mariana, and said, well, waste not, want not. He married her himself. He married his own niece, because he simply could not fathom looking outside the immediate family for a spouse. It is that kind of extreme, stubborn dynastic pride that leads to empires falling apart, and, more immediately, to facial features completely giving up. Which brings us to the most famous physical trait of this family, the Habsburg jaw. Clinically, it is known as mandibular prognathism. In plain terms, it means your lower jaw jutted out so far past your upper jaw that your teeth didn't meet. Imagine being the most powerful monarch on Earth. You controlled territories across Europe, the Americas, and the Philippines. You have literal fleets of galleons bringing you silver. And yet, you physically cannot eat a bowl of soup without making an incredible mess. The Habsburgs were profoundly self-conscious about this, but there was nowhere to hide. Court painters like Diego Velázquez had to earn their paychecks by trying to paint these monarchs in the most flattering light possible. You can almost see the artistic struggle on the canvas. The painter is desperately trying to use shadows and slightly turned profiles to hide the fact that the king looks like a half-baked Habsburg potato, but the jaw was undeniable. It was a genetic receipt for generations of keeping it in the family. Philip IV and his niece-wife, Mariana, had several children, but genetics, exhausted by this constant lack of variety, was struggling to produce a healthy heir. Most of their children passed away very quietly in the heavy, velvet-draped royal nurseries. But eventually, they managed to produce a surviving son, Charles II, as he was known in Spain, Carlos II. Let's pause and just look at poor Charles. If ever there was a historical figure who just needed a nap, a glass of water, and a completely different set of grandparents, it was Charles II. The people of Spain called him El Hechizado, which translates to the bewitched. They believed that his physical and mental ailments were the result of a dark curse, or perhaps witchcraft, because to the average 17th century Spanish peasant, it was much easier to believe in evil sorcery than to understand the concept of a recessive gene pool completely collapsing in on itself. He wasn't bewitched. He was just the mathematical outcome of a family tree that had folded in on itself like a biological origami crane. Charles was born into a state of permanent, quiet exhaustion. He didn't learn to walk until he was almost 8 years old. He didn't learn to speak until he was 4. And his Habsburg jaw was so severe that his tongue was too large for his mouth. When he spoke, it was just a slow, wet mumble that his courtiers had to lean in very closely to decipher. pretending they completely understood whatever royal decree he was trying to pronounce. His childhood was spent wrapped up in a dark, stuffy palace overprotected by a mother who was terrified he would break. And, to be fair, he might abe. His bones were incredibly fragile. He suffered from severe gastrointestinal issues because he physically couldn't chew his food properly. He just sort of swallowed things whole and hoped his royal stomach would sort it out. Imagine the daily routine of Charles II. The sheer, heavy boredom of it. He was the king of Spain, but he was too weak to lead armies, too uneducated to govern, and too fragile to even ride a horse properly. His days were spent slowly shuffling through the gloomy corridors of the Alcazar Palace in Madrid. He liked to play simple games, and he was surrounded by court dwarfs and jesters, who were probably the only people in the entire empire who treated him like an actual human being, rather than a fragile glass vase holding the entire Spanish succession. His physical ailments were treated with the absolute best medical care the 17th century had to offer, which is to say, they covered him in weird amulets, bled him with leeches, and placed recently deceased pigeons on his head to draw out the bad humors. Unsurprisingly, the dead pigeons did not cure his genetic bottleneck. It just made the palace smell worse. And yet, despite being sick his entire life, despite everyone at court constantly whispering that the king was surely going to pass away by Tuesday, Charles possessed a stubborn, lingering sort of endurance. He simply kept living, not thriving, not conquering, just softly, stubbornly existing. His marriages, of course, were a matter of desperate state security. He was married twice. First, to a French princess named Marie-Louise of Orleans. When she arrived in Spain, she took one look at a new husband. This frail, pale, severely underjawed, Boyanne realized exactly what she had married into. It is said she spent a lot of time crying quietly in her rooms. Charles, however, completely adored her. He followed her around the palace like a tired puppy. But despite their efforts, and the endless prayers of the Spanish court, they produced no children. After Marie-Louise tragically passed away, Charles was quickly married off again to Maria Anna. The pressure on this new queen to produce an heir was immense, but it was a biological impossibility. The Habsburg line in Spain was finally, definitively, running completely out of ink. Charles's final years were a slow, sad fade into the background. He lost his hair, he lost his teeth, he was nearly blind, and he spent his days just sitting by the fire, entirely overwhelmed by the weight of an empire he couldn't even mentally picture. When he finally passed away, just days before his 39th birthday, in the year 1700, the autopsy report left by the royal physician was practically a work of dark, surrealist literature. The doctor, completely baffled by a body so thoroughly compromised by inbreeding, wrote that the king's body did not contain a single drop of blood. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, his intestines rotten and gangrenous. He had a single testicle, black as squall, and his head was full of water. Now modern historians and doctors agree that this was likely a vast, dramatic exaggeration by a physician trying to explain why the king had been sick for 38 years straight, but it perfectly captures the tragic, exhausted end of the Spanish Habsburgs. They had tried so hard to keep everything in the family that eventually there was nothing left of the family at all. Just a quiet, empty palace, a massive portrait gallery of people with very long jaws, and an empire left completely up for grabs, which would inevitably lead to a massive European war. But for Charles, at least, the heavy, velvet-draped burden was finally over. He could just rest, and, as we leave the dusty, sunlit corridors of Spain behind us, we can appreciate the simple beauty of a wide, varied gene pool. It is quiet now. The ghosts of the Alcazar are settling down for the night. Air here is a little saltier, blowing in off the Atlantic. The palaces are slightly less gloomy, painted in soft pastels, and decorated with beautiful blue tiles. But do not let the pleasant aesthetics fool you. The Portuguese royal family, the House of Braganza, was just as firmly committed to the absolute, disastrous weirdness of European dynastic planning as their neighbors. Tonight, we are going to look at the life of Queen Maria I. She is known to history by two distinct nicknames in Portugal. In her early reign, she was called Maria the Pious. In her later reign, she was known as Maria the Mad. And really, Those two titles act as a perfectly sad, two-part table of contents for her entire life. It is a story of heavy velvet, relentless Catholic guilt, and a desperate, deeply surreal boat ride across the ocean. Let's start with her marriage, because it really sets the tone for the kind of family dynamics we are dealing with. Maria was the eldest daughter of King Joseph, the first of Portugal. Because her father had no sons, Maria was the heir presumptive. Now, usually, this is the point where a king looks around Europe to find a suitable, strapping young prince to marry his daughter and secure an alliance. But the Braganzas looked at the Spanish people who had literally bred themselves into a biological cormorant, apparently thought, you know what, they are onto something with this whole keeping it in the family concept. So, in 1760, at the age of 25, Maria was married. To whom? You might ask. To Pedro. Pedro was her father's younger brother. Yes. Maria married her own uncle. Now, even by the incredibly relaxed moral standards of 18th century royal matchmaking, marrying your uncle required a bit of paperwork. They actually had to get a special papal dispensation from the Pope to allow the wedding to go forward. You just have to imagine the Vatican clerks receiving that request, letting out a long, tired sigh, stamping the paper, and sending it back to Lisbon. Because why let a perfectly good crown fall into the hands of a foreigner when you can just pass it across the dinner table to your dad's brother? To be entirely fair to Pedro, who became King Pedro III when Maria took the throne, he was essentially a professional background character. He had absolutely zero interest in ruling. He was in his mid-40s when they married, and his main passions in life were attending religious ceremonies and staying entirely out of his wife's way. He was basically a well-dressed, highly religious house cat. Maria held all the actual power, and Pedro just sort of stood next to her in official portraits, looking vaguely surprised to be there. For the first decade or so of her reign, Maria was actually a fairly competent, if deeply anxious. This was the era of Maria the Pious. And when I say pious, I do not mean she simply attended church on Sundays. I mean she was entirely consumed by the crushing, heavy weight of eternal salvation. She was terrified of damnation, not just for herself, but for her entire country. She spent vast fortunes building the Basilica of the Estrela in Lisbon, a massive, ornate, heavily shadowed church where she could go to pray for hours on end. She surrounded herself with priests and confessors. The royal court, which under previous kings had been a place of music and parties and light-hearted scandal, became a very quiet, very serious place. It smelled constantly of incense and melted beeswax. Courtiers had to walk softly, speak quietly, and pretend they were spending all their free time meditating on the lives of the saints, just to keep the queen happy. It was a suffocatingly holy environment. But the human mind is fragile, especially when it is constantly vibrating with the fear of hellfire. And in the late 1780s, the universe decided to test Maria's fragile psychological ecosystem with a cascade of pure, unrelenting tragedy. First, in 1786, her husband Uncle Pedro died. Maria was genuinely devastated. Despite the genealogical weirdness of their union, they had been quite fond of each other. Then, just 2 years later, her eldest son and heir, Prince Jose, caught smallpox. Smallpox was the great, quiet equalizer of the royal courts. It didn't care about your titles or your papal dispensations. Prince Jose died at the age of 27, and if that wasn't enough, in that same year, her closest friend and personal confessor, Fray Ignacio Jason Caetano, also passed away. For Maria, losing her husband, her eldest son, and her spiritual guide in the span of 24 months was simply too much. The delicate scaffolding of her sanity, which had been propped up by rigid religious routine, completely collapsed. She didn't just become sad, she became entirely, irrevocably lost in her own mind. This is where the era of Maria the Mad truly begins. She became convinced that her soul was damned to hell. She believed she had offended God, and that her son's death was a personal punishment for her sins. She retreated to the Palace of Queluz, which is a beautiful, sprawling pink estate just outside of Lisbon. It was supposed to be a summer retreat, a place of light and fresh air. But Maria turned it into a gorgeous, pastel-colored prison. The accounts from the courtiers at this time are deeply sad and frankly, a little spooky. The Queen would refuse to sleep. She would wander the long, mirrored hallways of the palace in the middle of the night, dressed in heavy black mourning clothes, and she would scream. Not an angry scream, but a terrifying, hollow wail of pure spiritual agony. She would shout that the devil was waiting for her, that the floors were made of fire, that she could see demons hiding in the tapestries. Ladies-in-waiting, who were naturally exhausted and probably entirely traumatized, just had to follow her around with candles, speaking in soft, soothing tones, trying to convince the Queen of Portugal that the Ottoman was not, in fact, an agent of Satan. The royal family didn't know what to do. Mental illness was completely misunderstood in the 18th century. They eventually brought in Dr. Francis Willis, the same English physician who had famously treated King George III of England for his own bouts of madness. Dr. Willis's treatments were, by modern standards, essentially just polite torture. He believed in breaking the patient's will. He subjected the elderly Queen to ice baths, blistering on her skin, and unsurprisingly, plunging a deeply depressed, religiously terrified woman into freezing water and wrapping her in canvas, did not cure her. It just made her quiet. She withdrew even further into herself. Her surviving son, Prince John Hu, was now acting as Prince Regent because his mother was entirely incapable of signing a document essentially took over the country. Maria was just a ghost haunting the upper floors of the palace, and she could have just stayed there, slowly fading away into the history books as a tragic footnote, if it weren't for a man named Napoleon Bonaparte. Let's just drift forward to the year 1807. Napoleon's armies are sweeping across Europe. They have marched through Spain, and they are heading directly for Lisbon. The Portuguese army is completely outmatched. The French troops are just days away from the capital. Prince Regent John looks at the situation and makes a truly radical decision. He decides that the House of Braganza is not going to surrender. But they also aren't going to fight. They are going to pack up the entire government, the treasury, the royal library, the nobility, and the completely mad Queen, and they are going to sail across the Atlantic Ocean to their colony in Brazil. It is one of the most bizarre, chaotic evacuations in history. Imagine the docks of Lisbon in November 1807. It is pouring rain. The mud is everywhere. Thousands of aristocrats are frantically loading heavy wooden chests filled with silver, velvet gowns, and official state documents onto a fleet of wooden sailing ships. People are panicking. The French army is literally cresting the hills outside the city, and right in the middle of this cold, wet, terrified chaos is Queen Maria. She is 72 years old. She has barely left her rooms in 15 years, and now she is being bundled into a carriage, carried onto a rocking, damp ship, and told she is moving to South America. According to witnesses, as her carriage was racing toward the docks, the Queen suddenly had a moment of terrifying, lucid clarity. She reportedly looked at her frantic son and the terrified courtiers and said, "Do not go so fast. They will think we are running away." Which is, honestly, a spectacularly dry observation from a woman who had spent the last decade arguing with imaginary demons. Yes, Your Majesty, you are absolutely running away. To voyage to Brazil took 2 months. 2 months on the open ocean, in the cramped, damp, constantly rolling cabins of an 18th century galleon. The royal family suffered from terrible seasickness. An outbreak of lice forced the aristocratic women, including the princesses, to shave their heads and wear turbans made of whatever fabric they could find. And below decks, in the royal quarters, Queen Maria continued to suffer. The crashing of the waves against the hull just amplified her terror. The screaming continued, muffled by the heavy oak timbers and the sound of the wind. It was a miserable, claustrophobic nightmare. A floating hospital of seasick nobles and a deeply tormented monarch, slowly drifting toward the tropics. When they finally arrived in Rio de Janeiro in early 1808, the contrast could not have been more jarring. They had left a cold, wet, terrifyingly invaded Europe, and stepped off the boats into the bright, blinding, incredibly humid sunshine of Brazil. Rio was a colonial outpost. It was beautiful, surrounded by lush green mountains and sparkling blue water. But it was not a European capital. There were no grand palaces ready for them. The local colonial governor literally had to evict wealthy merchants from their homes to create makeshift royal residences. The Portuguese court, completely stripped of its dignity, sunburned and entirely disoriented, just had to awkwardly unpack their damp velvet clothes and pretend this was normal. For Maria, the change in scenery meant absolutely nothing. The geography had changed, but her internal landscape was still a dark, freezing dungeon. The bright Brazilian sun couldn't penetrate the heavy curtains she demanded be drawn in her rooms. She lived in the convent of Carmo in Rio de Janeiro, still wrapped in her black mourning clothes, still quietly weeping, still completely lost. She lived in Brazil for another 8 years, becoming the first and only European monarch to rule an empire from a colony. Not that she was doing any ruling, she was just existing. A fragile, elderly shadow sitting in a tropical room, completely unaware that the world outside was full of palm trees and parrots. When Queen Maria I finally passed away in 1816 at the age of 81, it was a quiet, almost relieved event. The heavy burden of her mind had finally, mercifully, been lifted. She was eventually brought back to Lisbon, years later, to be buried in the very same basilica of the Estrela that she had built during her pious, anxious youth. It is a deeply sad, remarkably long story of a woman who just could not bear the weight of the crown or the grief of her own life. She was crushed by the very systems that were supposed to elevate her, and she spent her final days an ocean away from everything she knew, surrounded by a court that was just waiting for her to finally, peacefully, close her eyes. So, as we leave the humid, sun-drenched coast of Rio de Janeiro, let's take a deep breath. Be grateful for the quiet. Be grateful for your calm, unburdened mind. Tonight, to close things out, we are going to drift far back in time. Past the Victorians with their exploding pipes, past the Habsburgs and their collapsing family tree. We are going to float back to the Middle Ages, into the dark, damp, incredibly drafty stone fortresses of Europe. We are going to talk about medieval royal children. If you look at history on paper, being born a medieval prince or princess looks like you won the ultimate lottery. You had unimaginable wealth, endless servants, and the divine mandate of God supposedly backing up your every whim. But the reality of a royal medieval childhood was actually just a bizarre mixture of extreme pampering and profound, borderline comical neglect. Let's start from the very beginning. The royal nursery. Today, we think of nurseries as bright, sunlit rooms painted in soft colors. A medieval royal nursery was, functionally speaking, a luxurious cave. Castles were built to keep armies out, not to let sunshine in. The windows were narrow arrow slits. The walls were thick, freezing stone that constantly sweated moisture. Tocombatis. They hung massive, heavy wool tapestries everywhere, which just trapped the dampness and the smell of wood smoke in the room. And, in Toti's deemed smoky environment, a royal baby was born. Now, medieval medical theory was entirely based on the idea of the four humors, and a general belief that the human body was essentially trying to ruin itself at all times. They believed that if a baby was allowed to move its limbs freely, it would literally grow up crooked. Because why trust millions of years of biology when you can just tightly bind an infant to a wooden board? Tease was called swaddling, but it wasn't the gentle, cozy wrapping we do today. Royal babies were wrapped tightly in linen strips from their neck to their toes, completely immobilizing them like tiny, angry royal burritos. They were kept like this for months. They couldn't crawl, they couldn't stretch. They were just carried around like highly decorated, crying footballs. And what did these swaddled little heirs eat? Well, certainly not water. The water in a medieval castle was basically a bacterial soup. So, from the moment they were weaned off their wet nurses, toddlers were given weak ale or heavily watered-down wine. Picture a 2-year-old duke, completely unable to bend his knees because of his heavy velvet tunic, quietly sipping a tiny goblet of warm, flat beer before nap time. It explains a lot about medieval history when you realize the entire ruling class spent their formative years slightly buzzed and incredibly itchy, because the clothing was truly unforgiving. There was no such thing as children's clothing in the Middle Ages. They just made adult clothes, but smaller. Imagine being a 4-year-old girl, and your daily outfit consists of a linen chemise, a heavy wool undergown, a stiff brocade overgown embroidered with actual metal gold threads, and a tight headdress that pinches your ears. You couldn't run. You couldn't play in the dirt. You just had to stand there, looking like a miniature, deeply uncomfortable adult, while foreign ambassadors judged your posture. Let's drift over to one specific, famously disastrous royal childhood. King Henry VI of England. Henry is a perfect example of what happens when the relentless machinery of the monarchy completely ignores the fact that a baby is, in fact, a baby. Henry's father, Henry V, the great warrior king, died suddenly of dysentery in France. This left little baby Henry as the King of England. He was exactly 9 months old. Now a logical system might pause and wait for the kid to learn how to speak, but the medieval English government simply scooped up this drooling, swaddled infant and placed him at the center of the political universe. When Henry was just a toddler, he was required to preside over Parliament. Who'st picture this deeply surreal scene? You have the House of Lords, the most powerful, terrifying, battle-hardened barons in England, all wearing heavy furs and scowling at each other. And sitting at the front of the room, on a massive jewel-encrusted throne, is a 2-year-old boy. His feet don't even come close to the edge of the seat. He is probably holding a wooden toy, or perhaps just staring blankly at the ceiling. The Chancellor would read out complex legal decrees about taxation and foreign wars, and they would look at the toddler for the royal assent. If the baby cooed, or burped, or just didn't start screaming, the lords would nod solemnly and say, "The king has spoken." Tax the peasants. It is the ultimate form of political theater. They were using a toddler as a constitutional prop. As Henry got older, his life didn't get much more normal. At age 8, he was crowned King of France as well, which involved him being paraded through the streets of Paris wearing a crown that was literally too heavy for his neck. Courtiers had to walk beside him, casually propping his head up so his cervical spine didn't just snap under the weight of his own divine right. Unsurprisingly, growing up like this, constantly manipulated by power-hungry uncles, treated as a religious icon rather than a child, and never allowed to just be a normal human, completely broke Henry. As an adult, he was famously gentle, entirely unsuited for ruling, and suffered from deep, catatonic mental breakdowns, where he wouldn't speak or move for months at a time. The English monarchy had built a perfect, gilded cage, and then wondered why the bird inside didn't know how to fly. But perhaps the most famously weird aspect of raising a royal child in this era was the concept of discipline. Kings were appointed by God. This was the fundamental rule of the medieval world. And because the king was chosen by God, his physical body was sacred. These created a massive logistical problem for royal tutors. How do you teach a spoiled, stubborn 8-year-old prince Latin grammar when it is literally a treasonous offense to smack him on the wrist? The medieval solution to this was a job title known as the whipping boy. It is exactly what it sounds like. The court would select a boy, usually of noble birth, to be the prince's constant companion. They would play together, eat together, and take their lessons together. They usually became very close friends, but if the prince refused to do his homework, or threw a tantrum, or broke a valuable vow, the tutor couldn't punish the prince. Instead, the tutor would grab the whipping boy and beat him right in front of the prince. The psychological warfare of this is just astounding. The logic was that the prince, seeing his best friend being punished for his own mistakes, would feel so guilty that he would correct his behavior. It was basically the medieval equivalent of yelling at your router when the internet is down, expecting the computer to feel bad about it. Sometimes it worked, and the prince would cry and promise to learn his verbs. But other times, you just ended up with a sociopathic prince who realized he could do absolutely whatever he wanted, and someone else would literally take the fall for it. It was a terrible system that bred deeply out-of-touch rulers who had never personally experienced a single consequence in their entire lives. And then there were the child marriages. We touched on this with the Habsburgs, but the medieval era really perfected the art of the incredibly awkward childhood betrayal. Royal children were essentially just very small, very expensive diplomatic poker chips. If England wanted peace with France, they didn't just sign a paper. They promised their 3-year-old daughter to the French king's 4-year-old son, and often, to ensure the deal was kept, the little princess would be packed up, taken away from her mother, and shipped across the ocean to grow up in the foreign court of her future in-law. Imagine being 5 years old. You are taken from your home. You are put on a damp, terrifying wooden ship. You arrive in a country where you don't speak the language, and you are introduced to a 6-year-old boy who you are told is your future husband. You are then raised by his parents in his castle, essentially growing up alongside your spouse, like annoyed siblings, until you hit puberty and the court abruptly tells you it's time to get married and produce an heir. It was a profoundly lonely way to grow up. These children were surrounded by hundreds of servants, but they had absolutely no control over their own destiny. They were watched constantly, guarded constantly, and used as pawns in games they were too young to even understand. So, as we bring our journey through the sad, weird, and deeply uncomfortable lives of historical royals to a close, just take one final moment to appreciate the mundane, beautiful simplicity of your own life. You do not have to wear a heavy, jewel-encrusted crown that hurts your neck. You do not have to marry your cousin to keep a treaty intact. You do not have to drink warm beer for breakfast, because the water might give you cholera. And you certainly do not have to worry about a terrified Victorian plumber trying to fix an exploded lead pipe outside your window. The empires have risen and fallen. The Habsburg jaw has faded into the history books. Queen Maria's ghosts have gone quiet, and the medieval castles are nothing but empty, drafty tourist attractions now. All that heavy, velvet history is safely locked away in the past. There is nothing left to do now but rest. Let the quiet of the night settle over you. Let the stories drift away like the fog over the River Thames. Close your eyes. Breathe easy and have a very, very good night.